So you want to make some soil blocks? Let's make some soil blocks. Okay, so there's a million different ways you could do this. I make a big batch at a time, so therefore I'm using a 50-gallon drum. This drum has a detachable lid with a ring. On the inside of the barrel, I fastened two 1-bys, and I'll show you why I did that in just a little bit. You can scale this down and just mix it up in a wheelbarrow, or use like one of these black concrete mixing tubs, which you're probably going to want to go buy something like this anyways pretty soon, and I'll show you that why as well later. But basically, this is how I do it. Okay, so 50-gallon barrel. My recipe comes out to about 42, 43 gallons. I do 20 gallons of peat moss. I do 10 gallons of perlite. I do 10 gallons of sifted compost, and I do 2.5 gallons of native soil or sand. My soil is very sandy, so it's more of a sand, but that's what I use. Your particular situation might be a little bit different. So just a quick breakdown. I've tried the Sunshine brand from Home Depot. I didn't really care for it. It's a little more chunky. This seems to be a little more fine. It's darker, which darker is always better to me. Perlite, I've tried using a size 2 once because that's all I could find. It's too big in a size 2. You want to get like a size 1 or smaller. This Hess brand I really like. I got this from IFA or local country store. I really do like this brand. It's 16 bucks. So this is what I'm using now. The compost that we have locally, it comes out of California. It's not really the best. It's still quite not broken down, and that's why I sift it. I sift it to a 1/4 inch minus. You can use like a mesh screen for that, but your compost might be a little bit better, so it might not apply to you, but I break it down to a 1/4 inch minus or less. The sand, I'll show you how I do that in just a second, but you need that to be really fine, because when you're making the mini blocks, this is my base mix. So I make my mini blocks and my 2-inch out of this. The amendments I add are a little bit different depending on if it's a mini or a 2-inch, but this is my base premix is what I call it. So the sand has to be really fine for the minis, and the same with the perlite. That's why it has to be much smaller. So let's go ahead and mix up the peat moss, and I'll show you how I do that. Okay, so I like to break my peat moss up. You'll see when they come in these bags, they're still kind of chunky. So I like to run it through a chipper. You could also run it through, use a mesh screen to kind of break it down, 1/4 inch mesh. That might work for you, but chipper is the quickest and easiest way for me, so that's how I do it. Also, be sure you wear a mask when you're doing this. This day and age, not too hard to find a mask. So perlite, peat moss, make sure you wear a mask, okay? Okay, so 20 gallons of peat moss. $10 gallons of perlite. Okay, so I already went through and put the 2.5 gallons of native soil into the blue barrel, but I want to show you what I do before I throw it in there. I use a food basket with kind of a bigger mesh screen initially, just to get a lot of the rocks and the chunks out. Then I come through with a much finer mesh, and this is a super fine mesh basket, and I run it through one more time, and basically, I don't know if you can see, but it comes out super fine. So 2-inch blocks is not that big of a deal, but like I said, I use this premix for both my minis and my 2-inch. And if you have chunky perlite or chunky peat moss or chunky sand or native soil, then the blocks, they're not going to want to form right. They're going to be really rough, and especially with the minis. So I like to sift everything and go from there. Okay, so next thing I want to do is I want to mix everything up. So what I like to do is I like to dump it out of my barrel. I use a snow shovel, mix it by hand for a minute, and I'm going to put it back in the barrel, roll the barrel around a little bit. Remember the 1-bys that are fastened inside? And that'll mix it up really well, so it's ready to go. Okay, so we got our barrel all done, mixed up. It should look something like this. So the hard part's done. Now it's time for the fun part. Okay, now that we got our barrel of premix all done, I want to talk really briefly about the amendments that I use. So when I'm throwing them in the tub, you kind of know what's going on. I know there's going to be all kinds of variations to this. This is just what I use. I think there's 3 or 4 that just about everybody uses, and then there's 3 or 4 that I use differently than some people, and vice versa. So let me just talk about them briefly. Blood meal, fast-acting nitrogen, also has iron in it, which is great for plants. Blood meal is going to break down quicker than something like a feather meal or another nitrogen source, but if you're growing organic, blood meal for the nitrogen is pretty much what everybody uses. For my pea, I use rock phosphate, soft rock phosphate. Soil mender, it comes a little bit chunky in this bag sometimes, so I like to use my fine wire mesh. When I get towards the end of the bag and got a bunch of clumps, I'll throw it in my blender and grind them up, and then sift them again and make sure it's nice and fine. That's what I use for my phosphorus. For my K, usually I use green sand. However, I'm currently out of green sand, so I'm going to be switching it up to kelp meal. I've used kelp meal in the past as a replacement. I've had really good results with it. So that's what I'm going to be using today. Kelp meal is a great product. It works wonders on your plants. So that is for my K. So for 2 other, what I would consider maybe secondary ingredients, the first one would be azomite. I know that a lot of people can't get their hands on azomite, but where I am, it's easy to get, so I like to use it. It has a lot of the trace elements that you're not going to find in the NP&K products, like copper, molybdenum, probably 14, maybe more other trace elements that plants really need. So I use azomite. And another ingredient I'm finding is really important in my plants. I kind of discovered this over the past year, but calcium is a must-have for me. It just works wonders on my plants lately, especially in my blocks. So this is a product called Kelzyme. It's mine here in Nevada, really high in calcium. You could also use something like oyster shell. I've used that in the past, works great. Some people use lime, but I'm using a product called Kelzyme. So 2 other additives I use, which is more of a biostimulant versus an amendment. First one would be Mycos. Everybody knows about mycorrhizal fungi. If you don't know about it, you need to read about it, but very important to plants. Helps with root growth and the uptake of nutrients. So Mycos. And then I also use a product called fulvic acid. This is kind of like the secret weapon that I don't really hear too many people talking about, but it'll work miracles for you. So fulvic acid is basically a refined version, or it's a finer version of humic acid. I use a pelleted version of humic acid out in the field when I'm making blocks, or I need a water soluble version of it for, like, you know, my drip system. I'll use fulvic acid. It's a chelator, key meaning claw in Latin. It helps, or chelae meaning claw. It helps to attach to nutrients so the plant can uptake them better. I have a lower CEC rating in my soil, so a chelating agent works wonders for me, and it really seems to help in my block. So fulvic acid, and last but not least, I'm going to be using a cup of home compost, because the compost I get is kind of dry and old. So I like to add a little bit of life. I'll use some home compost, and I'm going to be using a cup of worm castings. So just so you know how much I'm using, I usually make in a concrete tub, I'll make about 4.5 gallons of premix. And for every 4 gallons of premix, I'm going to use a 1/4 cup of blood meal, 1/4 cup of kelp meal, 1/4 cup of rock phosphorus, a 1/4 cup of azomite, a 1/4 cup of calcium, a cup of home post, a cup of worm castings, and I use a teaspoon of fulvic and a teaspoon of Mycos for every 4 gallons of premix. So with that being said, let's make some blocks. Okay, so rule of thumb usually with this premix is that for every part of premix, you're going to use half part water. So we used 4 gallons of premix, so we're going to get 2 gallons of water. We're going to take that water, we're going to add our fulvic and our Mycos, and we're going to stir it up, and then we're going to add that in. It's going to take a little bit more water than that, but we'll do that at the very end and dial it in exactly how we want it. So let me go get some water, and I'll be right back. So a lot of people start making blocks right away. You can do that. It's not the end of the world. I like to let it sit for a little bit. I just find that the blocks are a little bit softer, easier to work with, a little more defined, especially with the little divot on the minis. So let's let it rest for a little bit, and then we'll come back and make some blocks. Okay, so our mix has been sitting for a couple hours. It's pretty close to where we want, but it's not quite there yet. So we did the 1 part water to 2 part mix ratio, and it gets you really close. But if you see that it's still like really crumbly like this, that's still too dry. So we're gonna add a little bit of water to it and get it exactly how we want it. So use this watering can. Gonna mix it up a little bit more. See, now it's getting, it's not quite as crumbly, but it's a lot more chunky than it used to be. So we're almost there, but we're gonna add a little bit more. That's about how you want it. Like some people say, you can squeeze it and a little bit of water comes out. That's really close. So that'll be good enough for what we're doing today. So let me go get a blocker and we'll make a couple blocks. Okay, you can't really see it, but off to the side of me, I got a 2-gallon bucket of water that I like to keep my soil blocker in between each set of blocks. It just makes them come out a little bit smoother in my opinion. So before I start setting them in the tray, I always like to do a test set and make sure that my consistency is right. So you just kind of keep wiggling it. Try to drag the ends in, because the edges, the sides are the ones that don't want to seem to pack the most. And then I don't know if you can see it off camera, but as you press down you'll start to get a little bit of water. See, there's three squares full of water, but this one doesn't have any water coming up out of the top. So I'm going to try and get that edge just a little bit more. And then it's kind of hard to do it on camera, but as you can see now it's starting to fill in a little bit. So now I'm going to punch them out, just make sure they look the way I want. And that's pretty good. So, see if I can pick this up gently. They're a lot more fragile when they're wet. When they start to dry, they're a lot harder to break up. But that's kind of what you want right there. You don't want the edges looking really crumbly, like, you know, this is starting just a little bit right here. You don't want those edges crumbly. If these are chunky and crumbly, then you probably don't have quite enough water in there. So I'd add a little bit more and try it again. So, all right, so I'm going to get a tray and we'll set up a tray of blocks. Okay, I only made a handful of blocks here to show you real quick how I do this. Sometimes we use these trays, like an Elliott Coleman style tray, but my wife started some flowers in one of these that she got off of Amazon. It comes with the lid, pretty convenient. I like to use a 3/4 trowel. These come in really handy, especially if you're using the wooden style tray. You can they fit the block perfect, the minis, so you can just scrape them up, pick them up, and set them in your block. So if you're wondering why I'm using this, that's why. So let me grab one or two here, and you can just press them in just like that. And you can start to get pretty quick at this after a while. But great thing about minis is that if you don't have the best germination, I don't know if you can tell, but some of these didn't have, I mean, they maybe had 70-80% germination. So you didn't make a bunch of 2-inch blocks and now you're chucking those blocks somewhere. Minis, you can just pick out the minis that germinated and set them in your 2-inch and you're good to go. So that's all there is to it.